So today we're going to try and decode a really unique communication style. It's one that mashes up neuroscience, AI, and even physics all into a single thought. Now, from the outside, it can look, well, a little chaotic. But the source material we're digging into argues it's actually a super structured visual way of thinking. Our job here is to try and find the blueprint behind what might just seem like randomness.
And it all kicks off with this one pretty complex idea. The original text is in Dutch, and it's talking about communicating vessels, that concept from physics, and psychological gaming styles. I mean, at first glance, it's a lot. But this one sentence, believe it or not, is the key that unlocks a completely different way of seeing the world.
And that really is the big question for us today, isn't it? When you get a message that seems to break all the rules of communication, is it just noise? Or is it possible we're the ones missing the code, the key to a whole different kind of logic? Let's see if we can find that key. Okay, so first, let's frame this whole thing as a puzzle. We're on the hunt for the internal logic, the operating system of a communication style that just doesn't play well with the linear way most of us are taught to think. Now, to understand the proposed solution here, you've got to understand the problem it's trying to solve. And the source material starts by defining a specific way of thinking it calls the monotopic mind, which it sees as a major barrier to getting the big picture. The source calls it the monotrope Geist, which just translates to monotropic mind. And according to this framework, it's a thinking style that goes deep but not wide, It can focus like a laser on one subject, but it really struggles to connect that subject to anything outside of its narrow lane. It's an inability to pull data from different fields and see how they relate. To make this idea really stick, the source uses this powerful metaphor, a monorepo CRM. Just imagine a doctor's digital filing cabinet. Every single symptom, a headache, a fever, a weird rash, gets stored in its own separate file. But the system, the program itself, never connects them to realize, hey, these are all signs of the same underlying illness. That's the monotropic mind at work. And this right here, this perfectly illustrates the conflict. The monotropic mind is great at seeing the individual trees, all the isolated symptoms, all the separate data points. But it completely, totally misses the forest. It fails to see what the source calls één plaatje, which is Dutch for a complete picture. And that holistic view, that's the critical missing piece. All right, so let's flip the coin. As a direct counterpoint, the source material describes its own cognitive style, which it calls the multi-monotropic mind. And this is where things get really interesting, because this is a totally different systems-based approach to thinking. So the source calls this the multi-monotropische Geist. And get this, it's described as the mind of a dyslexic systems thinker that uses three-dimensional visual thinking. So instead of digging one deep, single trench, its job is to build bridges, connecting ideas from completely different worlds. So here's the breakdown of this thinking style. It's associative, it's nonlinear, and it thinks visually in 3D. It's constantly looking for connections between fields that seem totally separate. We're talking neuroscience, AI, physics, you name it. And the entire point of weaving all these different threads together is to hit that one ultimate goal, to create één plaatje, the complete, holistic picture. Okay, so we've met our two competing ways of thinking. Now let's put them side by side. This is really the core of it all. Integration versus silos. It's time for the head-to-head comparison. This table just lays it all out, nice and clear. The process? One mind is like a straight line. The other is more like a spider web. The scope? One drills down deep, the other pans out wide. And the metaphor says it all. A closed-off database versus communicating vessels. That physics idea where liquid and connected containers always flows freely between them to find a common level. And the outcome? One gives you a bunch of isolated facts, the other gives you the whole story. So how does this mind actually build that picture? Let's look at the layers it uses. Layer 1 is neuroscience. It pulls in concepts about specific parts of the brain, the parts that regulate our emotions and stress responses. The idea here is to ground the whole situation in actual biology, not just psychology. Now, on top of that biological layer, it adds a layer from artificial intelligence. It uses concepts like reinforcement learning to argue that those emotional responses we just talked about, well, they aren't random. Nope, they actually follow a logical, debuggable pattern, almost like a piece of computer code. This adds a whole new layer of systems and logic. And for the third layer, it brings in metaphors from physics. Ideas like magnetism and those communicating vessels we keep mentioning, they're used to describe how different systems interact, how influence gets passed around. Now, this isn't literal physics, of course. It's a model for understanding the invisible forces at play. So you take the biology, you add the computer code, and then you explain the whole thing using physics. And what's the result? You get in place, the final integrated model of the situation. It's the act of building one single, cohesive picture out of what first looked like a pile of random, unrelated puzzle pieces.
Okay, so we've taken these two minds apart, but what are the real-world stakes here? Why does this distinction between cognitive styles actually matter? This is where these abstract ideas crash right into the hard reality of how people interact with each other.
And here's why it matters so much. The source argues this isn't just some fun thought experiment. When a systems thinker tries to communicate with a linear system, that mismatch leads to very real consequences: misunderstanding, neglect, even discrimination. At its heart, this is a plea to recognize that there is more than one valid way to process the world. Which brings us full circle, right back to that powerful quote from the beginning. Interpretation always betrays someone's psychological gaming style. What this is really saying is that when we come across new information, the way we choose to understand it says just as much about our own mental programming as it does about the information itself.
And that leaves us with a final, pretty big question to think about. In a world that so often rewards just one particular style of communication, how many important, maybe even brilliant ideas are lost forever? Not because they're wrong, but simply because they're spoken in a cognitive language that we just haven't learned to hear yet.